They say comparison is the thief of joy. And honestly, I think most of us have heard that enough times that we've stopped really hearing it. It's become one of those phrases that floats past us without actually landing. But then something happens. You're scrolling, you see someone's promotion, their vacation photos, their perfectly curated version of a thriving life, and something in you quietly tightens. Maybe it's envy. Maybe it's something more ambiguous than that, harder to name, but it's there, doing its quiet damage before you've even thought to question it. Jealousy and envy, these aren't pretty emotions to admit to. We like to believe we're above them, but they're real, and they're doing something to us at a level we don't always consciously register. The discomfort of sitting with that truth is actually part of the problem. We scroll past it, distract ourselves, open another tab, and the feelings stay, lodged somewhere below the surface. Here's what I think doesn't get talked about enough. Our senses evolved specifically to compare. It wasn't vanity that wired us this way, it was survival. Our nervous systems were built to assess the environment, measure relative status, scan for threat and opportunity. For our ancestors, being aware of who had more resources, more alliances, more social standing, that wasn't ego, that was strategy. The problem is that biology didn't anticipate the feed. It didn't anticipate a world where, in a single thumb movement, you'd be exposed to the highlight reels of thousands of people, each one algorithmically curated to make you feel something. What was once a tool for navigating a small tribe has been handed a global stage, and it doesn't know how to turn itself off. So what do we actually do with this? Because I'm not going to pretend I'm immune to it. My own consciousness has been pulled into those loops more time than I'd like. You see someone doing what you want to do, living in a way that quietly reminds you of where you feel you've fallen short, and suddenly the lens through which you see your own life has shifted without you even consenting to the shift. The first move, if there is one, is simply awareness. Not the kind of awareness that just names the problem and moves on, but the kind that actually pauses and asks, how does this content make me feel? Not in a vague way, specifically. Does this feed leave me more energized or more depleted? Does it make me feel connected to something, or does it quietly amplify a feeling of not enough? Those questions sound simple. They aren't always easy to sit with honestly. And sometimes the answer leads somewhere uncomfortable, that maybe the stimuli itself needs to go. That some feeds, some environments, some social circles are functioning less like inspiration and more like slow erosion. The harder scenario isn't the app you can delete, it's the environment you're actually living inside. A workplace, a social circle, a family dynamic, where the comparisons aren't hypothetical, they're immediate and ambient. You can't unsubscribe from a room you have to be in. That's where reframing becomes less of a self-help concept and more of a genuine survival skill. Because the same situation can be looked at through many different lenses, not to force positivity onto something real, but because perception genuinely shapes the emotional weight of what we carry. There are many ways to shift perspective on comparison, and I want to explore those with you over time, in depth, honestly. Because the real question underneath all of this isn't just how to feel less envious, it's to what extent we should be measuring ourselves against anyone else at all, and who actually decided the metrics we've been using.
At some point, probably without noticing, you accepted a set of rules about what a good life looks like. A certain kind of job title, a timeline for relationships, a number in a bank account that would finally mean you'd made it, a body that looks a particular way, a lifestyle that photographs well. Nobody handed you a document to sign. There was no moment where someone sat you down and said, "Here are the terms." You just absorbed them through family, through school, through years of cultural osmosis so gradual that by the time you were old enough to question anything, the metrics already felt like your own. That's the quiet trick of inherited values. They don't announce themselves, they just become the water you swim in, invisible until you're gasping. I've thought about this a lot, because when I catch myself feeling behind or lesser or somehow not enough in comparison to someone else, it almost never holds up when I actually interrogate the standard I'm measuring myself against. Where did that standard come from? Who decided that's what winning looks like? A lot of it traces back to systems that were never designed with your actual well-being in mind. The idea that productivity equals worth, that came from somewhere. The idea that visible success is real success, that what can be shown matters more than what is actually felt, that came from somewhere too. These aren't natural laws, they're constructs, old ones, and we've just been living inside them so long that they've started to feel like gravity. There's something almost liberating about that realization, even if it's also a little disorienting. Because if the metrics were handed to you, that means they can be put down. Not all at once, that's not how it works, but examined, questioned, held up to the light and asked, does this actually reflect what I care about? Or am I just chasing something someone else told me I should want? The harder part is that some of the metrics aren't entirely wrong. Connection matters, stability matters, growth matters. But there's a difference between a value you've genuinely chosen and a standard you've inherited without consent. One is a compass, the other is a cage dressed up to look like a goal. You see it most clearly in that strange moment when someone achieves the thing, the promotion, the relationship, the house, and instead of feeling what they expected to feel, there's just a brief silence, and then the bar quietly moves again. Because the metric was never really measuring what actually matters. It was just measuring proximity to someone else's life. So what would it look like to build your own? Not in the abstract self-help sense where you make a vision board and call it intention, but actually sitting down with yourself and asking, what do I value when no one is watching? What does a day feel like when it's genuinely good, not just good looking? What kind of progress means something to me separate from whether anyone else can see it or validate it? Those questions are harder than they sound. We're not really trained to ask them. Most of the systems we moved through, school, work, social media, were built to produce measurable outputs, not to help us figure out what we actually want from being alive. And so, most of us arrive at some point in our lives holding a set of achievements or a set of failures that don't quite map onto how we actually feel inside. The mismatch is the thing worth investigating, because somewhere in that gap between the metrics you inherited and the life you actually sense you want, there's a more honest version of ambition waiting. One that's yours, not borrowed, not inherited, not measured against anyone else's coordinates at all.
Reframing gets a bad reputation, and honestly, some of it is deserved. There's a watered-down version of it that gets handed out like a pamphlet. Think positive. Look on the bright side. Everything happens for a reason. And if you've ever been in real pain and had someone offer you one of those, you know exactly how hollow they land. That's not reframing. That's avoidance wearing optimism as a costume. But underneath the self-help cliches, there's something genuinely worth understanding. Because the way you frame an experience, the story you build around it, the meaning you assign to it, the angle from which you choose to look at it, that isn't just window dressing. It actually shapes what the experience does to you over time. Not by changing the facts stay, but meaning is never just the facts. Meaning is the facts plus the interpretation, and the interpretation is always, to some degree, a choice. That's where the leverage is. One of the more useful reframes around comparison specifically is the shift from threat to information. When someone else's success registers as a threat to your standing, your timeline, your sense of what's still possible for you, the nervous system responds accordingly. It contracts. It defends. It starts quietly building a case for why the comparison isn't fair, or why their advantages explain the gap, or why you should feel worse about yourself than you did 5 minutes ago. None of that is useful. But telling yourself it isn't a threat when it feels like one doesn't work either. The body doesn't believe you. What can work is redirecting the attention, not away from the feeling, but toward a different question. Instead of, what does this say about me? Try, what does this tell me about what's possible?
That's not a small shift. It moves you from a closed loop of self-assessment into something more open, something with an exit. Another reframe that actually has cognitive backing behind it is temporal distancing. When you're inside a comparison that's making you feel behind or lesser, your perspective is almost entirely present tense. You're here, they're there. The gap is real and immediate and feels permanent. Temporal distancing asks you to move the camera, to look at this moment from 5 years out or 10, to ask whether the specific delta that's causing you distress right now will carry the same weight from that vantage point. Usually it won't. Not because the feelings aren't valid now, but because the frame was too tight to show you the full picture. The gap that feels defining today is almost never the gap that defines you. There's also something powerful in what some researchers call self-distancing, the practice of observing your own experience from a slight remove, the way you might if a close friend described the same situation to you. We're remarkably better at generating compassionate, proportionate responses for other people than we are for ourselves. The internal critic applies standards it would never apply outward. So sometimes the reframe is just, what would I actually say to someone I care about who was feeling exactly this way right now? And then trying, imperfectly, with some resistance, to offer that same response inward. None of these are tricks. They're not ways of lying to yourself about what's real. They're ways of loosening the grip of the first interpretation, the automatic one, the one that arrives before you've had any say in the matter, long enough to ask whether a different angle might be more accurate, more useful, more true to the full complexity of the situation. Perception isn't neutral. It never was. The question is just whether you're choosing it or inheriting it by default. And that question, once you really hear it, turns out to be one of the more quietly radical things you can sit with. Because somewhere between the story that's handed to you and the story you consciously construct, there's a version of events that actually serves you. It usually takes some looking to find it, but it's almost always there.
There's a piece of advice that gets passed around so often, it's practically wallpaper at this point. Run your own race. Stay in your lane. Focus on your own journey. And look, it's not wrong, but there's something a little too clean about the way it gets delivered, as if you can just decide one morning to stop caring what anyone else is doing and that's that. As if the track isn't shared, as if the other runners aren't right there, visible, sometimes pulling ahead in ways that are genuinely hard to ignore. I think the more honest version of that advice has to start with acknowledging the tension, not dissolving it. We're social creatures operating inside real systems. The job market is comparative by design. Creative spaces involve visibility and recognition. Even friendships carry subtle dynamics of who seems to be thriving and who seems to be struggling. Pretending otherwise doesn't make you enlightened, it just makes you less equipped to deal with what's actually happening. So maybe the question isn't how to stop comparing entirely. Maybe it's about what you do with the comparison once it shows up. Because there's a version of comparison that's genuinely corrosive, the kind that leaves you feeling smaller, less capable, quietly convinced that someone else's progress is somehow evidence of your own inadequacy. That version serves nothing. It doesn't motivate, it just erodes. But there's another version, rarer, harder to access, where someone else's trajectory becomes information rather than indictment, where you look at what someone has built and instead of collapsing inward, something in you goes, that's possible. That exists in the world. That could be a data point, not a verdict. The difference between those two responses isn't always personality. A lot of it comes down to whether you have a clear enough sense of your own direction that external reference points can't knock you completely off center. That's the real work underneath the advice to run your own race. Not ignoring the other runners, but knowing your own destination clearly enough that their position on the track stops being the most important variable. It sounds straightforward. It rarely is, because most of us are still figuring out where we're actually trying to go, and in that uncertainty, other people's paths become weirdly magnetic. They feel like evidence of something, a template, a proof of concept. And sometimes we start running towards someone else's finish line simply because it was visible and ours wasn't yet. I've caught myself doing this,
orienting towards something not because it genuinely called to me, but because the social signal around it was strong enough to temporarily feel like my own desire. It takes a certain stillness to separate those two things, what you actually want versus what looks compelling from the outside because someone else wants it or has it or seems to be happier for having pursued it. And that stillness is hard to come by when everything around you is designed to keep you in motion, in comparison, in reaction. Running your own race, in any meaningful sense, requires knowing what the race is actually for. Not in a grand existential way that paralyzes you with its scope, just a working answer, something honest. What are you building, and why does it matter to you specifically, not to the imagined audience watching, not to the version of yourself that needs to look like it's winning? When that answer is solid enough, other people's timelines start to loosen their grip. Not completely, not forever, but enough. Enough that you can be genuinely happy for someone else's success without needing it to mean something about yours. Enough that you can stay on your own track, even when you can't always see where it leads, because the direction itself has started to feel like enough of a reason to keep going.
Envy has a reputation problem. We treat it like something to be ashamed of, a character flaw to suppress, confess, or quietly bury before anyone notices. And so most of us get very good at not admitting it, even to ourselves. We dress it up as criticism. We call it skepticism. We say we're just being realistic about someone else's situation. But underneath all that management, the feeling is still there, and it's pointing at something. Here's the thing about envy that rarely gets said. It's not random. You don't feel it about everything equally. You don't spiral watching someone master a skill you genuinely have no interest in, or build a life that holds no appeal for you. The sting is specific, and that specificity is information. When envy shows up, really shows up, the kind that lingers, it almost always has coordinates. It's marking something on your internal map, something you want, or something you believe about yourself that you haven't fully examined yet. I've started to think of it less as a flaw and more as a signal that got scrambled somewhere in transit. The original message underneath the discomfort isn't, "You're not enough." It's closer to, "This matters to you. Pay attention here." The scramble happens because of how we've been conditioned to experience desire. Wanting things, especially things other people have, gets tangled up with shame almost immediately. So instead of sitting with the signal and asking what it's actually about, most of us short-circuit the whole process. We either drown the feeling in self-criticism or redirect it outward into resentment toward the person who triggered it. Neither one leads anywhere useful. The more productive move, and it takes some honesty to get there, is to treat envy like a strange kind of mirror. To ask, what exactly is it about this person's life or work or choices that's landing so hard? Is it the thing itself, or is it what the thing represents? Freedom, recognition, creative expression, a sense of having figured something out that you feel like you're still circling. Sometimes the answer surprises you. You realize you're not actually envious of the outcome. You're envious of the permission. The fact that someone else gave themselves permission to pursue something, to take up space with their ambition, to be seen trying. And somewhere in you, that permission still feels unavailable. That's where envy stops being about the other person entirely and starts being about the conversation you're not having with yourself. Used this way, consciously, curiously, envy becomes one of the more honest diagnostic tools available. Not comfortable, but honest. Because it bypasses all the rational stories we tell about what we want and goes straight to the emotional truth underneath. The question worth sitting with isn't, why do I feel this way about that person? It's, if I stripped away every obstacle, practical, social, psychological, and this feeling is pointing at something real, what would I actually be moving toward? What would I build? What would I try? What would I allow myself to want
openly without immediately hedging it with reasons why it probably won't work out. Envy, examined honestly, has a way of collapsing the distance between where you are and what you actually care about. It can't give you the thing, but it can make the thing visible in a way that nothing else quite does. Most people spend a lot of energy trying to feel less envious. What if the more interesting project was learning to read it, to follow it back to its source, and find out what's actually waiting there?
We've become very sophisticated editors of ourselves. Not in any malicious way necessarily, it's just that, over time, the habit of selecting, choosing which moments to share, which version of the story to tell, which angle of the photo captures the light just right. That habit starts to shape not just how we're seen, but how we see ourselves. And somewhere in that process, two versions of a life begin to quietly diverge. There's the lived life, the one with the unresolved mornings, the projects that stall, the relationships that are complicated in ways that don't compress into a caption, the long stretches of ordinary time that don't photograph particularly well but make up most of what existence actually feels like. And then there's the curated life, the one that exists in shared spaces, edited down to its most legible, most appealing, most coherent version. Both are real, but they're not the same thing, and the gap between them is where a particular kind of loneliness tends to live. What's strange is how this cuts in both directions. We perform a version of ourselves outward, and then we consume the performed versions of everyone else. So the comparison we're actually making is never life to life. It's always edited highlight to unedited interior. Your private reality measured against someone else's public presentation. That's a competition nobody can win because the terms are fundamentally rigged. I think about the kind of image we curate, not just online, but in person. The way we'll describe a difficult period after it's over in a way that makes it sound more intentional than it felt while we were inside it. The way struggle becomes narrative only in retrospect, cleaned up, given an arc, made to look like something we moved through with more grace than we actually had. There's something human about that. We need stories that cohere. We need to make sense of our experience, give it shape. But there's a cost when the performance starts running ahead of the actual living, when the pressure to have a life that reads well starts quietly distorting the choices made inside it. The more corrosive version is when we start making decisions based on how they'll appear, rather than how they'll feel. Staying in something because leaving would be hard to explain. Pursuing something not because it genuinely calls to you, but because it has cultural legibility. It makes sense to other people. It comes with social proof. It's the kind of ambition that gets nodded at. That's not really living. That's producing content about a life while the actual life waits somewhere off stage. And the audience we're producing it for, most of them are doing the exact same thing. Everyone curating for everyone else, and nobody quite sure what any of it actually feels like from the inside. What would it look like to close that gap a little? Not to perform struggle for relatability, not to swap one kind of curation for another, but to be in genuine contact with your own experience, the unedited version long enough to actually know what you think, what you want, what feels real versus what just looks good from a certain angle. That kind of contact is harder to come by than it sounds. It requires slowing down in ways that the current pace of everything actively discourages. It requires tolerating the parts of your life that don't have a clean narrative yet. But there's something on the other side of that tolerance that's worth moving toward. A life that feels inhabited rather than managed. Less produced, more yours. There's a version of this problem you can't log out of. You can delete the app. You can mute the accounts. You can restructure your feed until it barely resembles what it once was. And maybe that helps, for a while. But then you walk into a room, a workplace, a family dinner, a social gathering, where everyone seems to be at some legible stage of having figured things out, and the same machinery starts running. Except now there's no screen to put down.
Comparison in physical space operates differently than the digital kind. It's more immediate, more embodied. There's no buffer of glass and algorithm between you and the feeling. Someone mentions a salary, a relationship milestone, a new project gaining traction, and something in your chest registers it before your mind has even caught up. The body keeps score in these rooms. It knows the social geometry before you've consciously mapped it. What makes it harder is the expectation of presence. In a physical environment, especially one you return to regularly, you're supposed to be there, engaged, contributing. There isn't much room to quietly step back and process what's happening internally. The comparison happens, the feeling surfaces, and then life continues around you at full speed, expecting your participation. Workplaces are particularly interesting this way. They're built around visible progress, promotions, recognition, titles, assignments that signal someone's stock is rising, and most of us spend more waking hours inside those structures than anywhere else. Which means the comparison isn't incidental, it's practically baked into the architecture. Family dynamics carry their own specific gravity. The cousin who bought a house, the sibling whose career has a momentum yours doesn't seem to have right now, the parent whose approval still maps, somewhere underneath everything, onto a set of criteria you may never have consciously agreed to. These aren't abstract social media strangers. These are people whose opinions of you have weight, whose trajectories feel adjacent to yours in ways that are genuinely hard to hold lightly. And yet, the same principle applies here as anywhere else. The feeling itself isn't the enemy, it's information. The question is what you do with it in real time, in a room with other people present and no private space to process. One thing that helps, not perfectly, but genuinely, is developing a small internal distance from the reaction as it happens. Not suppressing it, not performing equanimity you don't actually feel, just noticing. Something just landed. There's a contraction happening. And choosing, even slightly, not to immediately identify with it, to hold it loosely rather than let it quietly reorganize your entire sense of yourself for the rest of the evening. That's a skill, and it takes practice. It's easier on days when your own sense of direction is clear. It's harder when you're in a period of uncertainty, when your own narrative feels incomplete and other people's seems frustratingly legible by comparison. And there's also something to be said for honesty, at least with yourself, about which environments are genuinely nourishing and which ones are just familiar. Familiarity and nourishment are not the same thing. Some rooms we keep returning to out of obligation, or history, or a vague hope that this time the dynamic will feel different. And sometimes it does. But sometimes the most clarifying thing you can do is acknowledge that a particular environment consistently leaves you feeling lesser. And this is not a permanent fact about you. It's a fact about the fit. And fit can change. Environments can be renegotiated, sometimes slowly, sometimes more decisively than we expect. The room doesn't always have to win.
I want to ask you something that sounds simple and isn't. What would it actually feel like enough? Not temporarily, not in the afterglow of an achievement that quiets the noise for a few days before it starts again, but genuinely, stably, a baseline sense that what you are and what you've done and where you currently are is, in some meaningful way, sufficient. Most of us have never really stayed with that question long enough to find out if we have an honest answer, because the machinery around us doesn't pause long enough to let us. There's always the next thing, a next level, a next version of the goal that gets installed the moment the previous one is reached. And we call that ambition, which isn't wrong exactly, but it's worth asking at some point whether the motion is actually towards something or whether it's become its own justification, running because stopping feels worse than running. Enough is a strange concept to sit with in a culture that has built its entire operating system around more. More productivity, more optimization, more growth, more reach, more output, more presence,
more followers, more income, more experiences to document and file away as evidence that the life is being lived correctly. The implicit message underneath all of it is that where you are right now is a problem to be solved, a gap to be closed. And so, sufficiency starts to feel almost transgressive, like admitting you feel like enough is the same as admitting you've stopped caring, as if contentment and complacency are the same thing, which they absolutely are not, but the culture doesn't always make that distinction easy to hold on to. Contentment is presence. It's being in genuine contact with what's actually here, rather than perpetually oriented toward what isn't yet. Complacency is avoidance, using the appearance of acceptance to sidestep something you're actually just afraid to face. They can look similar from the outside. They feel completely different from the inside. I think the reason enough feels so elusive for most people isn't because they haven't achieved the right things yet. It's because enough was never really attached to the achievements in the first place. It was always a feeling, an internal state that was being outsourced to external conditions. And external conditions are, by definition, always changing, always provisional, always one shift away from destabilizing whatever sense of sufficiency you'd managed to build on top of them. There's a version of enough that doesn't require the circumstances to be perfect, that doesn't wait for the debt to be cleared, the relationship to be resolved, the project to land the way you hoped, the body to look the way you think it should. It's harder to access, but it's also more durable, because it's not resting on anything that can be taken away. I'm not suggesting anyone arrive at some permanent plateau of satisfied stillness. That doesn't sound like living, it sounds like a waiting room. What I'm more interested in is the practice of touching enough, briefly, regularly, of building in moments where the forward motion pauses and something in you gets to acknowledge, this is real, this exists, I exist inside it. Not as a finish line, more like a resting place you return to, a place to recalibrate before continuing. Because the people who seem most genuinely at ease, not the ones performing ease, but the ones who carry it quietly, they don't seem to have solved the problem of more. They seem to have just found a different relationship to now. Which makes me wonder if enough was never really a destination. Maybe it's closer to a practice, something you choose, imperfectly, over and over again, in between all the reaching and the wanting and the not yet.
The mind keeps score whether you ask it to or not. You can intellectually reject the idea of competition. You can genuinely believe, and mean it, that other people's success has nothing to do with yours. You can read the right books, absorb the right frameworks, arrive at a considered philosophical position about the futility of comparison. And then someone you know gets the thing you quietly wanted, and something in you registers it immediately, involuntarily, like a scoreboard updating in a room you didn't know you were still sitting in. That's the ego's leaderboard. It runs in the background, mostly out of view, tallying things you never consciously decided to tally. Who's ahead? Who's behind? Who's pulling away? And who seems to be stuck? It doesn't care about your values or your spiritual practice, or how clearly you understand that the whole framework is constructed. It just keeps updating. The interesting question isn't how to shut it off. I'm not sure that's actually possible or even entirely desirable. The interesting question is what it's actually protecting. Because the ego's scorekeeping isn't random noise. It developed for a reason. In environments where social standing determined access to resources, belonging, safety, tracking relative position wasn't vanity, it was intelligence. The leaderboard was functional. The problem is that the environment changed faster than the software. We're running ancient threat detection code in conditions it was never designed for, measuring ourselves against people we'll never meet, in domains that have nothing to do with survival, using metrics that shift constantly and were never agreed upon. And the leaderboard never gets a notification that the game has changed. It just keeps running.
What's worth examining is which entries you've allowed onto the board without questioning, because not every comparison that registers emotionally deserves to be taken seriously as a signal. Some of them are pure reflex, leftover code executing without any meaningful relationship to what you actually care about. The colleague's promotion that stings even though you don't want their job, the friend's relationship milestone that lands with a weight you can't quite justify, the stranger's creative work that quietly makes you feel like you're behind on something even though their path has nothing to do with yours. These aren't all the same. Some of them are worth following, back to something real, something you genuinely want and haven't given yourself permission to pursue. But some of them are just the leaderboard running unattended, scoring things out of habit, out of wiring, out of a survival mechanism that never got the memo that you're not actually competing for the same resources anymore. The practice, if there is one, is learning to tell the difference, to notice when the score has updated and ask calmly whether this particular entry belongs on the board at all. Not to shame yourself for having the reaction, not to perform detachment you don't feel, just to introduce a small gap between the reflex and the meaning you assign to it. Because the moment you stop automatically treating every comparison as evidence of something, as proof of where you stand, what you lack, how far you still have to go, the leaderboard starts to lose some of its authority. It doesn't disappear, but it starts to feel less like a verdict and more like an old habit, something the mind does, rather than something the mind is. And in that small distinction, there's more room to move, more room to want things on your own terms, to measure progress against your own previous positions rather than someone else's current one, to let other people's wins exist in the world without needing to locate yourself in relation to them. The leaderboard will keep running, but you don't have to keep checking the score.